The November wind was sharp as it brushed against my cheeks, while the train slowly crawled into the station of my hometown. The windows fogged up with every breath I exhaled, and almost unconsciously, I drew circles on the glass the way I used to when I was a little girl waiting for my father to appear on the platform. For a long time, I sat there staring at the familiar sight of barren trees, cracked pavements, and tiny shops lined along the quiet street outside the station. The city skyline had vanished hours earlier. All that remained now were fields stretching endlessly and houses that seemed too silent compared to the restless chaos of where I lived. And yet this silence carried a familiarity that pierced through my chest like a needle. It had been years since I last returned home for Thanksgiving. Pride and unspoken conflicts had become invisible walls that separated me from my family. Work had given me excuses to stay away, but deep inside I knew it was not deadlines that had kept me distant. It was fear. Fear of being rejected once more. Fear of stepping into a place that had once been my home and realizing I was no longer welcome. And yet, this year, an inexplicable voice inside urged me to come back. Perhaps it was nostalgia, perhaps longing, or perhaps a desperate attempt to prove to myself that even broken families could find their way back to each other. I told myself over and over again that this time would be different. The station was almost deserted. An old ceiling fan squeaked as it spun lazily above. The voice coming from the loudspeaker announced the next train in a monotone drawl that echoed across the empty hall. I tightened my coat, feeling the cold settle into my bones. No one was waiting for me, and I had not expected anyone to be there, but the absence of familiar faces still carved a hollow ache in my chest. There was a time when my parents stood eagerly on this very platform. I can still see my mother's smile, her hands waving a scarf she had knitted, and my father pushing through the crowd insisting on carrying my bag even though I was already old enough to carry it myself. That picture had faded long ago. It was replaced by silence, distance, and a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind. I walked out of the station, dragging my suitcase behind me. The wheels clattered against every uneven stone on the pavement. A taxi driver, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, stepped forward and opened the trunk for me. His hands were rough, his movements slow, but his eyes carried the kind of kindness strangers sometimes offer without asking for anything in return. "Heading home for Thanksgiving?" he asked as he placed my luggage inside. "Yes," I replied quietly. My voice almost disappeared in the cold air. He gave me a long glance in the rearview mirror as he started the car. "Family is always complicated," he said with a faint smile. I forced one back, feeling the truth of his words pressing down on me. "Yes, it is." The drive stretched on in silence. Outside, fields rolled past like endless waves. Barns stood abandoned with roofs that sagged under the weight of time. The maple trees along the roadside had shed almost all their leaves, their branches stretched like dark arms toward the sky. I rested my head against the window and watched the familiar world blur by. And then, without asking, memories began to return. I remembered being 10 years old, sitting at the long dining table while my sister Emma dazzled everyone with her perfect posture and her clever little jokes. She was always the one who knew exactly what to say, exactly how to behave. She shined effortlessly in every room, and my parents loved her for it. My father's eyes would soften when he looked at her. My mother's hands would fuss over her hair as if Emma was some rare treasure that needed to be polished constantly. And then there was me, the restless daughter. The one who questioned everything, who argued when rules felt unfair, who never knew how to hold her tongue when silence would have saved me. I can still hear my father's stern voice the night I refused to attend a charity gala. He called me ungrateful and selfish. I had only wanted to spend the evening writing in my journal, something that gave me peace. My mother said nothing, but her silence was worse than anger because it meant agreement with him. And when Emma smiled sweetly and offered to go in my place, she earned not just praise but a comparison that carved into me like a blade. That was the pattern of our lives. Emma was the golden child, I was the shadow. The taxi turned, and my heart clenched as we drove down the familiar driveway lined with tall oaks. At the end of it stood the mansion I once called home. Its tall windows glowed with golden light, and the faint sound of laughter drifted into the night air. It looked beautiful from a distance, like a picture out of a magazine, promising warmth and joy. But I knew what lay behind those glowing windows. A family polished to perfection on the outside, but inside, cracks ran deep, covered by tradition and pride. I sat still in the taxi long after it stopped. My heart was pounding violently, as though warning me not to step forward. My fingers trembled as I opened my wallet to pay the driver. He handed me my suitcase and wished me good luck. His voice lingered with me as I stood on the gravel path, staring at the front entrance. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted out from the house, wrapping around me with both comfort and cruelty. I could almost hear the clinking of glasses, the way everyone would laugh at Emma's jokes, the way my father would raise a glass to toast to family, as though family had always been his greatest pride. My chest ached. For a moment, I closed my eyes and saw a younger version of myself racing up these very steps, eager to be the first one inside, eager to belong. But those days were long gone. I pulled my coat tighter and adjusted the scarf around my neck. Each step toward the door felt like dragging chains. I could hear voices rising and falling inside, one of them unmistakably Emma's melodic laugh. My heart twisted at the sound. She had always been adored, and perhaps she still was. I told myself that maybe things had changed, maybe time had softened the edges of disappointment, maybe my parents would open the door with arms stretched wide, welcoming me home at last. Hope is a cruel thing, but it clings stubbornly, even when it should have died years ago. I reached the front steps and stared at the brass knocker gleaming under the porch light. My reflection wavered in its surface, older, wiser, but still carrying the face of a daughter desperate for approval. I lifted my hand slowly, my breath caught in my chest. This was Thanksgiving, a day meant for forgiveness, a day meant for family, a day meant for second chances. At least, that was what I wanted to believe. My hand lingered on the brass knocker longer than it should have. The polished surface was icy cold, and the metal seemed to steal the warmth straight from my skin. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart beating against my ribs as though it wanted to escape. Through the narrow panes of glass that framed the door, I saw golden light dancing across polished floors. I could make out faint silhouettes moving gracefully inside. The laughter carried easily through the walls, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who had no worry in the world. I wanted to imagine that laughter was waiting for me as well, that if I knocked, the door would open and arms would wrap around me, pulling me into the circle where I belonged. At last, I lifted the knocker and let it fall. The sound was heavy and final. The echo seemed to travel through the wood, through the hallways I once ran barefoot as a child, through the rooms that still held pieces of my memory. I froze, waiting. For a second, nothing happened. Then came the muffled footsteps, deliberate and steady. My breath caught. I gripped the handle of my suitcase tighter as the doorknob turned slowly. The door opened. My father stood there, tall and immovable, his posture as strict as the house itself. His hair had turned silver, but his eyes were unchanged, cold, sharp, and merciless. Those eyes had silenced me countless times as a child. Standing beside him was my mother, graceful as always, draped in elegance. The pearl necklace on her throat shimmered under the chandelier behind her. Her face was calm, almost too calm, as if she had prepared herself for this very moment. Neither of them smiled. "Stephanie," my father said at last. My name fell from his lips like an accusation rather than a greeting. My throat tightened. I forced a small smile. "Hi, Dad. Hi, Mom. Happy Thanksgiving." For a flicker of a moment, I thought I saw something soften in my mother's eyes, but it vanished almost instantly. She shifted her gaze away, as though the sight of me was something she could not bear. I tried to step forward, dragging my suitcase across the threshold. "I thought I would surprise you," I said gently. "It has been too long." But his hand rose abruptly, stopping me as effectively as if he had slammed the door in my face. His palm pressed against the frame, commanding, immovable. "You should not be here," he said, each word clipped and final. The air seemed to thin around me. "What do you mean?" My voice cracked despite my effort to keep it calm. "It is Thanksgiving. I came home." His jaw hardened. The disappointment etched into his face deepened like carved stone. "You are not invited." The world seemed to tilt. I blinked, waiting for him to take the words back, to admit this was some cruel attempt at discipline. But he did not move. He meant every syllable. I looked at my mother, begging silently for her to intervene. "Mom," I whispered, "please, it is me, your daughter. I just want to spend the holiday together." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she clutched the pearls at her neck, holding them like a shield. Her eyes flickered with something I could not quite read, shame, fear, or simply the desire for me to disappear. "Why?" The question escaped me, raw and aching. "Why am I not welcome?" My father's voice was steady, unflinching. "You made your choice when you walked away from this family. You turned your back on our name, our traditions, everything we stand for. Now you come back expecting us to forget. We cannot allow that." Memories surged up, unbidden. The night I told him I was leaving his company to build something of my own. His rage had filled the house, his voice booming that I was ungrateful, that I would regret walking away from the legacy he had prepared for me. My mother had stood in silence, watching me as if I were a stranger. Emma had sat quietly, her lips pressed together to hide a smirk of victory. That was the night the distance became unbridgeable. "I never stopped being your daughter," I said now, my voice trembling. "I never stopped wanting to be part of this family." His expression did not change. "Not tonight, not under this roof." Behind him, I could see the dining hall glowing with light. The long oak table was covered with linen, crystal glasses sparkling beneath the chandelier. I could hear voices rising, laughter spilling as Emma told another of her stories. She had always known how to charm a crowd, how to claim all the attention. It had always been her gift and my curse. I turned back to my mother. "Please, just let me come inside. Just for tonight, I will not cause trouble, I promise." Her eyes glistened, but she did not speak. At last she whispered, almost inaudible, "Stephanie, do not make this harder. It is better this way." Better for them, never for me. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me crumble. I straightened my shoulders, though every part of me trembled. My father's arm did not waver. His hand stayed firm against the frame. My mother's silence sealed the sentence. Slowly, I stepped back. My suitcase dragged behind me, its wheels crunching against the gravel of the driveway. My father's eyes followed me without an ounce of regret. My mother looked away once more. And then, with a soft click, the door closed. The sound echoed like thunder in the empty night. I stood there staring at the shut door, the golden light now nothing more than a glow against the windows. The laughter inside continued, muffled but cruelly clear. They were celebrating without me. They were whole without me. My hands shook, my body numb. I had come searching for warmth and forgiveness, but what I found was rejection as cold as the wind biting my skin. For a long time, I could not move. I simply stood there, a ghost at the doorstep of the house that had once been my world. Finally, I turned away. Each step down the driveway felt heavier than the last. The mansion loomed behind me, glowing with a warmth I would never touch again. As the tears finally fell, freezing on my cheeks, I realized something. If they would not have me as their daughter, then I would no longer beg for their love. They had cast me out, but I would rise again, stronger, brighter, untouchable. That night, under the silent November sky, grief carved into me deeply. But within that grief, a spark ignited. A spark that would one day burn into something far greater than they ever imagined. I walked down the driveway, dragging my suitcase across the gravel. Each crunch beneath my heels felt like a drumbeat in a funeral march. The house behind me grew smaller, though its light still glowed stubbornly against the darkness. That glow was not for me. It was for the family gathered inside, sipping wine, laughing, sharing stories of togetherness while I was left outside, a shadow pressed against the cold. The November night wrapped itself around me, the air biting against my cheeks. I wiped away tears that refused to stop falling. They had cast me out as if I were nothing, as if all the years I had spent under that roof meant nothing at all. And yet, in a strange way, the rejection felt almost familiar. It was simply the culmination of something that had begun long ago. Memories swirled unbidden, crashing into me with every step I took. I remembered being a little girl standing at the edge of the living room while Emma played piano. Her fingers danced effortlessly across the keys, filling the air with melodies that charmed everyone in the room. My parents stood close, smiling proudly, showering her with praise. I had stood there clutching the notebook where I had scribbled stories of my own imagination, waiting for a chance to share. But no one asked. No one noticed. My voice was drowned beneath the applause for her perfect performance. Another memory followed. I was 14, sitting at the dining table, my report card clutched in my trembling hands. I had worked so hard that semester, pouring myself into every subject, determined to prove that I was more than the rebellious daughter they saw me as. When I handed my grades to my father, he glanced at them briefly and nodded without expression. Then Emma announced she had won another pageant title, and suddenly the entire dinner was about her. They raised glasses in her honor, my mother kissed her cheek, and I sat there in silence with my achievements forgotten between the dishes of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. It was always like that. Emma sparkled, and I disappeared. The ache in my chest deepened as I remembered the countless arguments with my father. He believed obedience was love, and silence was respect. I believed questions were necessary, truth was important, and fairness was not something to be bartered. Those beliefs clashed again and again until my very presence became a battle. When I was 16 and dared to refuse attending a business dinner he demanded, he called me selfish, irresponsible, and a disappointment. I had spent the night crying in my room, my pillow soaked with tears, while Emma charmed the guests in my place. The next morning, my mother avoided my eyes, and my father did not speak to me for days. Even in small moments, the wounds grew. Emma wore the dresses my mother carefully chose, while I wore whatever I could afford from part-time jobs because my choices never pleased them. Emma received gifts for every birthday, elegant jewelry, or expensive perfumes. I received lectures about my stubbornness, warnings that I would ruin my future if I did not learn to be more like her. But the heaviest memory of all was the night I chose to leave. I was 22, working under my father in his company. I had dreams of creating something of my own, of building an independent life where I could be seen for who I was rather than the shadow of someone else's expectations. I told him I wanted to resign. His face had turned red with rage. He called me ungrateful, foolish, blind to the opportunities he had laid before me. My mother sat silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes lowered. Emma's lips curled in a quiet smile that no one but me noticed. And when I walked out that night, suitcase in hand, the slam of the door behind me was the sound of a bond breaking. Tonight, when my father said I was not invited, I realized nothing had changed. Time had not softened his heart. Silence had not shifted my mother's loyalty. Emma still had the place I once longed for. I was still the outsider. The weight of those old wounds pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. My footsteps slowed, and I sat down on the edge of the quiet road, my suitcase beside me. The cold seeped into my body, but I barely felt it. All I felt was the ache of rejection that had been planted in me years ago, now grown into something unbearable. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me, one by one. The first time I was called stubborn. The first time I was compared to Emma. The first time I was punished for speaking the truth. Each memory was a stone, and together they built the wall that separated me from them. Tonight, that wall had become a fortress, keeping me out forever. And yet, as I sat there, shivering in the night, I felt something else stirring deep inside me. Beneath the pain was anger. Not the childish anger I used to feel when I was ignored, but a sharper, clearer fury. They had wounded me, yes, but they had also underestimated me. They believed shutting a door could define me, that their rejection was the end of my story. But it was not. The weight of old wounds was heavy, but it also gave me strength. Every slight, every dismissal, every rejection had carved resilience into my bones. I would rise from this. I would not remain the forgotten daughter forever. The night was long, and I had nowhere to go. But in that loneliness, I made a promise to myself. One day I would return, not as a girl begging for love, but as a woman they could no longer ignore. One day I would stand before them, not seeking a place at their table, but showing them that I had built my own. For now, though, I let the tears fall freely. I let the pain pour out of me, washing the years of silence and disappointment from my heart. The weight of old wounds pressed heavy against me, but it also reminded me of who I was. I was not Emma. I never would be. And that was my greatest strength. As dawn began to paint the horizon in shades of pale blue, I rose slowly to my feet. My body ached, my eyes were swollen, but inside me burned a fragile ember of resolve. The house still glowed behind me, but I did not look back, because the past had already done its damage. Now it was time to carry those wounds forward, to let them shape me, to let them guide me into becoming someone stronger than they ever imagined. The gravel of the driveway still echoed in my ears long after the mansion disappeared behind the trees. I walked without a destination, my suitcase bumping unevenly against the road. The wheels rattled like a broken rhythm, a sound that matched the chaos inside me. The November air grew colder with each passing hour, and the night wrapped itself around me like a heavy cloak. Streetlights flickered at long intervals, casting pale circles on the cracked pavement, leaving long stretches of darkness in between. I kept my eyes on the ground, afraid that if I looked up, the weight of the stars above would crush me. Every breath came out in a cloud, a visible reminder of the loneliness clinging to me. I wanted to scream, but the silence of the night seemed too fragile to break. For years, I had convinced myself that distance from my family was temporary, that one day I would return and they would finally see me. I carried that hope like a talisman, something to protect me when the city felt too harsh and the world too indifferent. Tonight, that hope had been shattered at the doorstep of the house that once defined my world. And with it, something inside me collapsed. I walked past familiar streets, though they felt strange now, like scenes from a play I no longer belonged in. The bakery where I used to spend afternoons with Emma, eating muffins and giggling about nothing at all, was closed and dark. The park where I had once hidden beneath the oak trees, reading my secret stories, was nothing but a shadow. Every corner held ghosts, but none of them offered comfort. The loneliness gnawed at me until my legs ached, but I did not stop. I told myself that if I kept moving, perhaps the ache in my chest would not swallow me whole. My suitcase felt heavier with every block, dragging me down like an anchor tied to old memories. At last, I stopped beneath a flickering streetlight, my breath ragged, my cheeks wet with tears I had stopped trying to hide. There was no one on the road, no witness to my unraveling. The world carried on without me. Cars passed in the distance, their headlights slicing briefly through the darkness before vanishing again. Somewhere, dogs barked, and the sound of a train whistle echoed faintly through the night. I was part of none of it. I sat down on a bench near the bus stop, clutching my suitcase as if it were the only proof I existed. The cold metal of the bench seeped into my body, chilling me to the bone. I wanted to sleep, but fear kept me awake. Fear of closing my eyes and seeing again the image of my father's cold stare, my mother's silence, the door closing in my face. Hours seemed to pass. My phone buzzed once with a message, and for a moment my heart leapt. But it was not from them. It was a reminder from a colleague about a project deadline, a small, cruel reminder that the rest of the world had moved on while I sat abandoned at a bus stop. When footsteps approached, I stiffened. A man in a heavy coat walked past me, glancing briefly in my direction before disappearing into the dark. Later, a young woman carrying groceries paused near the bench, her eyes filled with curiosity, perhaps even pity, before she hurried away. Strangers came and went, but none stopped. I was invisible, even to those who passed close enough to touch. I thought about calling a hotel, but the thought of walking into a warm lobby and pretending I was fine felt unbearable. I thought about calling a friend in the city, but shame clawed at me. How could I explain that my own parents had turned me away on Thanksgiving night? How could I put into words the kind of rejection that left scars no one could see? So I stayed. I sat with my suitcase and my silence, watching the night crawl slowly toward dawn. Somewhere between exhaustion and despair, anger stirred again. It was faint, like an ember buried beneath ash, but it glowed nonetheless. They had cast me out, but I was still here. They had closed their doors, but I still had roads before me. Perhaps they thought I would crumble, but I refused to give them that satisfaction. I stood up, my legs trembling but determined. The bus stop was empty, the schedule unreadable in the dim light, but I decided I would not wait for rescue. I would move forward, even if I had to carry myself step by step into the unknown. The night was lonely, yes, but it was also wide, filled with endless possibilities. If I was no longer their daughter, then I was free to become something else, someone else. The thought terrified me, but it also lit a strange kind of hope. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, I walked on, my suitcase rolling behind me. The night had not broken me. It had stripped me bare, exposed every wound, but it had also whispered a truth I had long ignored. I did not need their acceptance to exist. I did not need their table to feast. I did not need their love to live. The road stretched long before me, and though it was empty, it was mine. The gravel of the driveway still echoed in my ears long after the mansion vanished behind the trees. My suitcase rattled as I pulled it along, its uneven wheels thumping against the cracks of the old road. The sound was loud in the silence, an unwanted companion reminding me of the weight I carried. Every step away from that house felt like walking deeper into exile. The November air was merciless. The cold pressed against my cheeks and seeped into my bones, the kind of cold that does not simply surround you but invades you, becoming part of your body. Streetlights stood at long intervals, their weak bulbs flickering as though they too were weary. Between each circle of pale light stretched wide pools of darkness that seemed endless. I kept moving, my breath forming fragile clouds that broke apart instantly in the air. I wanted to believe that somewhere, someone might notice me. That perhaps a window would open and a voice would call out, asking if I was lost, if I needed warmth. But the houses I passed were shuttered tight, their windows glowing faintly with warmth I could not reach. Behind those walls, families sat together, hands clasped, laughter echoing over steaming plates of food. Thanksgiving had room for everyone, it seemed, everyone but me. My legs carried me forward out of habit rather than will. My mind was trapped in the past, dragging me backward even as my body stumbled onward. I saw flashes of childhood, of running down these very streets with Emma, our hands sticky from stolen candy. I saw the night sky filled with fireworks when I was 12, and my parents clapped as Emma twirled in her new dress. I remembered how proud I had been of the short story I wrote that same evening, a story no one read. Each memory stung like salt in fresh wounds. The further I walked, the heavier my suitcase grew, though it carried nothing more than clothes and papers. It was as though it had swallowed the rejection I had just endured, and now it dragged me down with it. At last, unable to carry the weight, I set it down and sat on its edge beneath a flickering street lamp. The glow washed over me in trembling pulses, illuminating my face in brief moments before plunging me back into shadow. I wondered if this was what my life had always been, small bursts of light followed by long stretches of darkness. Tears came again, though I thought I had exhausted them already. They slid down my cheeks silently, freezing against my skin. I pressed my palms against my face, willing myself to stop, but grief is never something one can control. It demands to be felt, and I was drowning in it. A car passed slowly, its headlights brushing over me. For a moment I hoped it would stop. I even stood, ready to wave, but the car kept moving until its lights disappeared down the road. I sank back onto the suitcase, smaller than I had ever felt. At some point, footsteps approached. I stiffened, clutching the handle of my bag. A man in a heavy coat walked past, his gaze sliding briefly over me. He did not slow down. He did not ask if I was all right. He simply kept walking, his figure swallowed quickly by the darkness. Later, a young woman carrying grocery bags paused for only a second, her eyes wide with curiosity, maybe pity, but she hurried away without a word. Strangers noticed me, but I remained invisible. That was the cruelest kind of loneliness, being seen but not acknowledged. I considered calling a hotel. My phone was in my pocket, its screen glowing faintly when I checked it. But the idea of walking into a bright lobby, smiling politely, pretending I had arrived by choice, not rejection. It felt unbearable. Shame wrapped around me tighter than the cold. I thought about calling a friend back in the city. My fingers hovered over the contact list. But what would I say? That my parents had turned me away like an unwanted guest? That even on Thanksgiving, when families gather and forgive, mine had chosen pride over love? No words could disguise the humiliation. I slid the phone back into my pocket, my throat aching. So I stayed where I was. I sat at the bus stop bench, the cold metal biting into me, my suitcase at my feet. The hours stretched endlessly. Time seemed frozen, as though the world itself had paused to watch my misery. The night was a mirror, showing me every fear, every wound, every doubt I had carried for years. But somewhere beneath the despair, anger stirred. It was small at first, no more than a whisper, but it grew with each passing minute. They had cast me out. They had left me in the cold while they dined in comfort. But I was still standing. I was not broken, not yet. Perhaps they thought this rejection would end me, but it would not. It would mark the beginning of something else, something they could not control. I rose slowly from the bench, my legs stiff, my body aching from the chill. The sky above was a black canvas, but on the horizon, faint streaks of pale blue began to emerge. Dawn was coming. The night had stripped me bare, but it had not destroyed me. I looked at the road stretching ahead. It was empty, uncertain, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest sense of freedom. If they no longer claimed me, then I belonged only to myself. And that was terrifying, but also strangely beautiful. I picked up my suitcase and began to walk again. My steps were slow but steady. The sound of the wheels rolling across the pavement no longer felt like a chain dragging me down. It felt like a rhythm, a reminder that I was still moving forward. As the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops, I whispered to myself, "I will not be erased." The words hung in the air, fragile but defiant. The night had been lonely. It had been cruel, but it also showed me something important. I did not need their acceptance to survive. I did not need their table to belong. My story would not end on their doorstep. The road ahead was long, uncertain, and filled with shadows, but it was mine to walk. And I would walk it, no matter how heavy the weight of my wounds might be. The first light of dawn stretched timidly across the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and pale gold. I had walked all night, dragging my suitcase like a wounded soldier carrying armor too heavy for battle. My body ached with exhaustion, my eyes stung from tears that refused to dry, and yet I kept moving because stopping meant sinking into despair. The town was slowly waking. Coffee shops flickered with warm lights, bakeries lifted their shutters, and the faint smell of fresh bread drifted through the crisp air. I stopped at a bench outside a small convenience store, too drained to take another step. My suitcase leaned against my leg, a loyal but heavy companion. I sat there, numb, watching strangers hurry past, each wrapped in their own world. None of them noticed me. To them, I was just another tired traveler, invisible in my loneliness. That was when he appeared. A man in his late 30s stepped out of the convenience store carrying a cup of steaming coffee in one hand and a paper bag in the other. He was tall, with messy dark hair that looked like it had fought with sleep and lost. His coat was worn at the edges, his shoes scuffed, but his presence was warm, like sunlight piercing through clouds. He glanced at me briefly as he passed, and unlike the others, he did not look away. His gaze lingered, curious but not intrusive, kind but not pitying. "You look like you could use something warm," he said softly, his voice low and steady. I blinked at him, startled. My throat felt too tight to answer. Without waiting for permission, he extended the cup of coffee toward me. The steam curled in the air between us, carrying the scent of roasted beans and comfort. "I already had one," he added with a small smile. "This one's extra." For a moment, suspicion flickered through me. Years of rejection had taught me to doubt kindness, to search for hidden motives. But his eyes were steady, his smile gentle. Against the sharp memory of my parents' coldness, his gesture felt almost unreal. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I took the cup carefully, the heat seeping instantly into my frozen hands. I held it close, savoring the warmth as though it might reach my heart. He sat down on the bench beside me, leaving a respectful distance. He did not ask questions right away. Instead, he opened the paper bag and pulled out a small croissant, tearing it in half. He held out a piece to me. "Eat," he said simply. "It helps." My stomach growled in betrayal, reminding me I had not eaten since yesterday afternoon. Embarrassed, I accepted the pastry and took a small bite. The buttery flakes melted on my tongue, and suddenly I felt tears sting my eyes again. Not because of the food itself, but because anyone had thought of me. We sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee, sharing the quiet morning. It was a fragile peace, but it was more than I had expected after a night like mine. Finally, he spoke again. "Rough night?" I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in my throat. "You could say that." He did not press. He only nodded as though he understood without needing the details. "Name, Daniel," he said after a pause, extending his hand. "Stephanie," I answered, my fingers cold as they touched his. "Well, Stephanie," he said, leaning back against the bench, "whatever happened, it hasn't beaten you. You're still here. That counts for something." I wanted to argue, to tell him that being alive did not mean being whole, that surviving rejection felt more like failure than triumph. But something in his tone silenced me. His words were not meant to fix me. They were simply a reminder that existing in spite of pain was already an act of strength. The bus stop across the street filled with people rushing to work, their chatter filling the air. For the first time since the night began, I did not feel completely invisible. Daniel's presence grounded me like a lighthouse in a storm. We talked in fragments. I told him only pieces of the truth, that I had returned home for the holiday and it had not gone the way I hoped. He did not ask for more. Instead, he shared a little of his own life. He was a carpenter, working odd jobs in town. He had grown up here, left for years, and only recently returned after his own life had crumbled elsewhere. There was no grand story, no sermon, just quiet honesty. It was strange, but comforting. Here was a man who owed me nothing, who had no reason to care, and yet his small acts of kindness made me feel more human than my own family had in years. When I shivered, he stood and pulled a scarf from his coat pocket. "Take it," he said, handing it to me. "I can't," I protested weakly. "You can," he replied. "I have another at home, humor me." I wrapped the scarf around my neck. It smelled faintly of cedar and sawdust. For the first time since last night, warmth touched more than just my skin. As the sun climbed higher, the streets grew busier. I knew I could not sit there forever. Daniel seemed to sense it too. He stood, stretching, and gave me a final nod. "You'll figure it out," he said. "People like you always do." Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I sat there clutching the scarf, the empty coffee cup at my feet. My heart ached, but it ached differently now. Not only with grief, but with gratitude. The night had shown me rejection, but the morning had shown me kindness. And in that fragile balance, I found the faintest reason to keep walking. Silence has a way of becoming both a prison and a sanctuary. In the days that followed, I discovered that silence could break me, but it could also rebuild me if I learned to hold it carefully in my hands. After that morning at the bench, Daniel's scarf still warmed my neck, though he had disappeared back into his own life. His kindness lingered like a small flame inside me. It was not enough to banish the shadows of rejection, but it was enough to remind me that the world still held pieces of light. I found a modest room for rent above a florist's shop on the edge of town. The landlady was an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, with gray curls pinned neatly and hands that smelled faintly of roses. She did not ask questions when I knocked on her door with tired eyes and a heavy suitcase. She simply looked at me, nodded once, and said, "Room 3 is available. Sheets are clean, rent is fair, and the kettle works if you like tea." That was all I needed. The room was small, barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a narrow wardrobe. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in one corner, but the window overlooked the street below where people passed each day. At night, the florist locked her shop, but the faint fragrance of lilies and carnations always drifted upward, filling the air with something gentle. For the first time in years, I was alone in a space that was mine. No voices to judge me, no comparisons to Emma, no footsteps echoing down marble hallways, just silence. At first it frightened me. Without noise to fill the gaps, my mind replayed the memories I wanted to escape. The door shutting in my face, my father's eyes hard as stone, my mother's silence like a knife pressed to my throat. The silence made me hear those words again and again, "You are not invited." But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence began to change. I started waking early, before the town stirred. I would sit at the desk with a notebook and let words spill out. At first they were messy fragments, scraps of anger and sorrow tangled together. But over time, they grew into sentences, then paragraphs. I wrote about nights spent walking beneath flickering streetlights, about the sound of laughter I could not join, about the loneliness of being unwanted by your own blood. Writing did not erase the pain, but it gave the pain a shape, and once it had shape, it no longer felt infinite. In the afternoons, I wandered the streets. Sometimes I would pass the mansion from afar, watching from the opposite side of the road. The golden windows still glowed, the voices still carried through the gates. Emma's car was often parked in the driveway, sleek and polished, a symbol of everything I never was. I never lingered long. Watching too closely felt like pressing my hand to an open wound. But even from a distance, I promised myself that one day I would not be standing outside looking in. One day I would return on my own terms. I began to work odd jobs. Mrs. Patterson let me help in the florist's shop when business grew busy. My hands learned the language of flowers, roses for passion, lilies for mourning, carnations for gratitude. Each bouquet was a story, and arranging them brought me a strange peace. Later, I found part-time work at a small bookstore 2 streets away. The scent of old pages wrapped around me like an embrace each shift. Customers came and went, some polite, some dismissive, but in the quiet of the shop I felt safe. Every coin I earned went into a small tin box I hid beneath my bed. It was not much, but it was mine, untainted by my father's wealth or Emma's privileges. For the first time, I was building something with my own hands. It was fragile, but it was freedom. At night, I returned to my notebook. The silence of my room became fertile ground for words I had buried for years. I wrote letters I never sent, letters to my father demanding why his love had conditions, letters to my mother begging her to see me, letters to Emma confessing how her laughter had always felt like a blade. And then I wrote letters to myself, forgiving the girl who had tried so hard to belong. Those letters made me weep, but they also stitched something inside me that had been torn for too long. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. The first snow fell, covering the town in white silence. I walked through it with my scarf wrapped tight, my breath fogging before me, and for the first time the silence did not suffocate. It was soothing. Sometimes I saw Daniel again. He would appear in town, carrying wood for his carpentry, his hands rough and strong. Once he stopped by the florist, buying wildflowers just because. Another time, he came to the bookstore, asking for a manual on repairing antique furniture. Each meeting was brief, casual, but his presence reminded me that kindness did not vanish just because family had failed me. He never asked about my wounds, but his eyes seemed to say he knew they existed, and that was enough. There were nights when grief still found me. Nights when I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, imagining the mansion's warm lights and the voices inside. On those nights, I wept quietly, clutching my pillow like a lifeline. But unlike before, I no longer drowned in sorrow. I let it wash over me, then recede, leaving me stronger for having survived it. The silence taught me patience. It taught me to listen not to the voices of judgment that had haunted me, but to the steady rhythm of my own heart. I realized I did not need applause to know my worth. I did not need permission to dream. The silence became my teacher, shaping me into someone steadier, sharper, unbreakable. One evening, as snowflakes drifted outside the window, I looked at my reflection in the glass. My eyes were tired, yes, but they were not the same eyes that had stared helplessly at the closed door weeks ago. They were steadier, filled with something harder than hope. determination. That night, I whispered to myself, they thought I would crumble. They thought rejection would silence me, but silence is where I have found my strength. And at that moment, I believed it. The snow had begun to thaw, leaving the streets slick with melting ice and dirty slush. Winter was loosening its grip on the town, and with it, something inside me shifted too. I had spent weeks in silence, building strength within myself, writing words that stitched together my broken spirit. But silence alone could not carry me forever. Silence had given me clarity, and with that clarity came a decision. I would not merely survive their rejection. I would turn it into fire. It was not about childish vengeance. I no longer longed for my father's praise or my mother's approval. The little girl who used to ache for their love was gone. What remained was a woman who understood the cost of being invisible, a woman who knew the sting of abandonment. My revenge would not be loud or reckless. It would be patient, precise, inevitable. I began by watching. From the window of my rented room, I could see the rhythm of the town unfold each day. The florist shop below brought customers from every corner, wealthy women buying bouquets for dinner parties, young men nervously choosing roses for their lovers, old men clutching carnations for graves. People spoke freely in the shop, never noticing me in the corner, arranging stems or wrapping paper. I listened. I learned. Gossip was a river, and if you stood still long enough, it carried everything past you. From whispers, I gathered pieces of the life my family continued to live without me. Emma's name came often, spoken with admiration, envy, sometimes disdain. She was everywhere, hosting charity events, appearing in society pages, smiling from the covers of glossy magazines that flaunted her beauty and charm. But beneath the admiration were cracks. People whispered of debts hidden under her polished life, of arrogance that grated even on her admirers, of secrets too fragile to be exposed. I stored every word. Every rumor was a thread, and I was weaving them into a net. The bookstore became another classroom. Customers there were quieter, more thoughtful, but they too left trails behind them. Lawyers came for reference books, businessmen sought biographies, young students whispered about their professors. I learned to read between lines, to see patterns in fragments of conversation. Power was not only in wealth or beauty. Power was in information. And information, I realized, was abundant for those patient enough to listen. Daniel noticed my growing intensity. One evening, as he stopped by the shop for wildflowers, he tilted his head at me. "You look different," he said. "Sharper, like you've decided something." I met his gaze and gave a small smile. "Maybe I have." He did not press. That was one of the reasons I trusted him, though I never told him everything. The fire I was building was mine alone to tend. My first tangible step came quietly. I visited the Public Records Office, a nondescript building with dusty shelves and tired clerks. I spent hours there, combing through business registries, property deeds, and court filings. My father's company was vast, but vastness often hid vulnerabilities. Contracts, mergers, silent partners, each document revealed more than the polished stories they presented to the world. I copied notes carefully, storing them in a folder I kept hidden beneath my mattress. Each page was a weapon waiting to be sharpened. At night, I returned to my notebook, but my words changed. They were no longer only letters of sorrow or forgiveness. They became plans, outlines, strategies. I wrote lists of people connected to my family, friends, allies, rivals. I mapped their strengths and their weaknesses, their loyalties and their betrayals. I built a web, and at the center of it sat my parents and Emma, shining like prey who did not yet know the hunter had arrived. Revenge was not quick. Revenge was art. I began practicing the art of blending in. At gatherings in town, I dressed modestly but with care, speaking little but listening much. People dismissed me as a quiet girl helping at the florist or shelving books in the store. They did not see the mind behind my silence. That invisibility, once a curse, had become my weapon. If they could not see me, they could not stop me. One evening, I passed by the mansion again. From the gate, I saw Emma stepping out in a glittering gown, cameras flashing as reporters swarmed her. My parents stood nearby, polished smiles plastered across their faces. They looked untouchable, radiant, adored. I stood in the shadows, my breath misting in the cold air, and I whispered to myself, "The higher they shine, the harder they will fall." It was not hatred that filled me, it was justice. A justice long denied. The first steps were small, almost invisible. A quiet inquiry here, a note taken there. A seed of doubt planted in conversations. A letter drafted to a rival of my father's company, unsigned, slipping hints of vulnerabilities. No one knew it was me. No one suspected the quiet girl with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes. But I knew, and the knowledge gave me power. Late one night, as I sat at my desk with papers spread before me, I realized something. Revenge was not only about destroying them, it was about rebuilding myself. Every step I took toward their downfall was also a step away from the shattered girl they had abandoned. Every secret uncovered, every plan written, was proof that I was no longer powerless. The silence that once suffocated me had become the forge where I built my strength. And now, I was ready to test the edges of the blade I had been sharpening. My family believed they had erased me. They believed rejection would bury me forever. But I had risen in the shadows, and in those shadows I had begun to weave the first steps of their undoing. The town adored Emma. Everywhere I went, her name was painted in gold on people's tongues. She was the elegant daughter, the radiant star, the woman whose smile graced magazines and whose presence lit up every charity gala. To the outside world, she was flawless. But I had lived too long in her shadow not to know that perfection was a mask, and masks, if pressed hard enough, begin to crack. It started with whispers. At the florist's shop one afternoon, a pair of women in fur coats leaned across the counter, their voices low but sharp. "Did you hear about the dress she wore at the winter gala? They say it wasn't bought, it was borrowed, from a designer who hasn't been paid yet." The second woman gasped, delighted by the scandal disguised as gossip. "I always wondered how she managed to keep up appearances. Perhaps the money isn't as steady as it seems." I kept my head down, wrapping their bouquet of orchids, but my ears absorbed every word. A borrowed dress, an unpaid designer, small details, but they chipped away at the shining facade. Later that week at the bookstore, I overheard two businessmen flipping through financial journals. "The company's quarterly report doesn't look right," one muttered. "Too polished, too clean. There's talk of hidden losses. And wasn't there a rumor about a lawsuit last year?" The other shrugged, but his frown lingered. "If the cracks spread, people will notice." Again, I made no sign of listening. But inside me, something stirred like the tightening of a bowstring. The threads I had begun weaving were tugging at the corners of their golden tapestry. I started to act with more precision. Small, calculated steps, an anonymous letter to a reporter hinting at inconsistencies in Emma's charity fund. A slip of information placed into the right ears about my father's questionable contracts. I did not invent lies, I only guided truths into the light. Truth, after all, is the sharpest blade. The results came slowly, but they came. A journalist published a short article questioning the transparency of Emma's latest fundraising gala. The piece was cautious, wrapped in polite language, but the seed was planted. Donors whispered. Socialites asked quiet questions. The next time Emma appeared in public, her smile seemed just a little tighter, her laughter just a little forced. I saw it in their eyes when I passed the mansion from across the street. My father's expression was stern, his shoulders stiff, as though the weight of control was slipping. My mother clung to Emma more closely than usual, her smile brittle. To outsiders, it still looked like a perfect family, but I could see the hairline fractures. I knew the signs of pressure. I had lived under them. One evening, at a cafe near the town square, I sat in the corner with my notebook. The air buzzed with conversation. At the table beside me, two young women whispered, their voices carrying despite their attempts at secrecy. "She's not as untouchable as she looks," one said. "I was at the gala, and I swear half the vendors complained they hadn't been paid on time." The other leaned in eagerly. "And her fiancé, did you hear he postponed their engagement party again? Some say he's having second thoughts." I sipped my tea, hiding my smile behind the steam. The cracks were widening. Daniel noticed the change in me. One night, as we walked together down a quiet street dusted with snow, he studied my face carefully. "You've been carrying something," he said. "Something heavier than before." I hesitated. I could not tell him everything, not yet. My revenge was a secret still forming its shape. But I met his gaze and said, "Sometimes truth has a way of finding its way out, even if people try to bury it." He nodded slowly, as though he understood more than I gave him credit for. He didn't press, and I was grateful. The following weeks brought more signs. A delayed payment here, a canceled event there. Invitations to Emma's soirees grew fewer, her photographs in magazines accompanied by cautious captions instead of unbridled praise. I saw her once in person, stepping out of a car in the town square. Cameras still flashed, but her eyes darted nervously, her smile straining under the weight of whispers she could not silence. Watching her stumble, even slightly, filled me with conflicting emotions. Part of me exulted, justice was moving, however slowly. But another part of me ached, remembering the little sister who used to braid my hair when we were children, who used to hold my hand in the dark. I reminded myself that the Emma I loved back then no longer existed. The woman who remained was a stranger draped in perfection, and strangers could not be spared. I kept weaving. Quietly, steadily, relentlessly. By spring, the cracks were undeniable. A headline in the local paper read, "Charity accounts under review, questions surround gala finances." My father dismissed it as jealousy from competitors, my mother called it a misunderstanding, but the town buzzed with speculation. Emma still smiled for the cameras, but the shine in her eyes was gone, and I, standing unseen in the crowd, knew this was only the beginning. The golden image was crumbling. Piece by piece, truth was unmasking them. They had thought rejection would erase me. Instead, it had sharpened me into something they could not control. And now, as I closed my notebook one evening with steady hands, I whispered to myself, "This is only the first crack. The wall has yet to fall." Spring arrived not with gentle warmth but with storms. Rain hammered against the town for days, flooding streets, pulling down branches, and soaking the flowers in the shop until their petals sagged heavy with water. It was as if the sky itself conspired to wash away illusions, and with the storms came the breaking of masks. The first blow landed in the newspaper. A full-page article, no longer polite whispers but bold print, exposed irregularities in the financial reports of my father's company. Words like fraud, embezzlement, and mismanagement screamed from the headlines. The article included quotes from unnamed insiders, speaking of debts hidden in shell accounts, of contracts written to deceive. I read the piece 3 times, my fingers trembling with both triumph and disbelief. I had sown seeds, yes, but I had not expected the storm to bloom so quickly, so violently. The town buzzed with scandal. At the bookstore, customers no longer whispered Emma's name with admiration but with sharp curiosity, with disdain edged in their voices. At the florist, women clucked their tongues as they bought lilies for funerals. "I always knew something wasn't right," one said smugly. "Families that look too perfect always hide rot underneath." Another replied, "And Emma, such arrogance. No wonder the mask finally slipped." I listened silently, my hands steady as I tied ribbons, but inside, a storm raged. Days later, another headline followed, "Charity Gala Funds Missing, Investigation Underway." The very event that had been Emma's crown jewel now strangled her reputation. Donors demanded answers, journalists circled like wolves, and social media burned with speculation. Photos of Emma, once flawless and adored, now filled the internet with mocking captions and cruel memes. The Golden Girl had become a public spectacle. I saw her once on the street, chased by reporters. Her hair, usually perfect, clung damply to her face in the rain. Cameras flashed relentlessly, their questions sharp and merciless. "Emma, is it true the funds are missing? Emma, do you have a response to the fraud allegations? Emma, where is your fiancé?" She pushed past them, her voice cracking as she cried, "No comment." For the first time in years, she looked small, cornered, afraid, and I, hidden beneath my scarf, watched with a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. The girl I had once loved as a sister was unraveling before the world, and though part of me ached for her, the larger part whispered, "This is justice." Inside the mansion, tension boiled. Through whispers carried by the town's gossips, I learned that my father's temper erupted in fury behind closed doors. He blamed Emma for the charity scandal, blamed my mother for indulging her, blamed everyone but himself. My mother, once silent and composed, was said to cry in front of the staff, her mask crumbling under pressure. Servants whispered of shouting matches, of broken glass, of a family tearing itself apart. And still, the world kept watching. The fiancé, who had once been paraded as Emma's perfect partner, finally broke his silence. In a statement released to the press, he announced that the engagement was postponed indefinitely, citing personal differences. The polite phrasing could not disguise the truth. He was abandoning a sinking ship. That night, I stood across the street from the mansion, rain soaking through my coat, watching the lights flicker inside. I imagined them shouting, Emma's voice rising in desperation, my father slamming his fist against the table, my mother pleading for calm. They had banished me to preserve their image, and now that image was burning before the world's eyes. I should have felt only triumph. Yet, as lightning split the sky and thunder rolled above, I felt something deeper, heavier. Revenge was never clean. It carried a weight, and I bore it alone, but I also felt power. For the first time, I was not the girl standing outside the gate, begging to be let in. I was the storm battering their walls. They did not know it was me. They could not see my hand guiding the cracks wider, pushing truth into the light. But I knew, and knowledge is its own kind of victory. Daniel found me that evening in the cafe, staring out at the rain. He sat across from me, his presence steady, grounding. "You've been watching," he said softly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I admitted. His eyes searched mine. "And how does it feel?" I looked down at my hands, fingers curled tightly around my cup. "Like fire, it burns, but it keeps me alive." He nodded slowly, as though he understood more than I said. "Just don't let the fire consume you." His words lingered in my mind long after he left. The fire was mine, but could it devour me as easily as it devoured them? The following week, the mansion's gates remained closed, reporters camping outside day and night. Paparazzi photographs showed Emma looking hollow-eyed, my father looking gaunt with rage, my mother shrinking into herself. Their empire, once golden, now looked fragile and tarnished. And I, writing in my notebook by candlelight, whispered to myself, "This is only the breaking point. The fall has only just begun." The mansion that once towered like an untouchable fortress now stood as a crumbling relic of pride. Its gates were rusted with neglect, the gardens overgrown, its walls stripped of the glittering life they once held. The golden family portrait my parents had built for the world had shattered into ash, carried away by scandal and betrayal. News outlets feasted on their downfall. Headlines screamed of embezzlement charges, lawsuits, and frozen accounts. My father, once feared and revered, was now summoned to courtrooms under the eyes of cameras. His polished suits looked ill-fitting on his diminished frame. My mother, who had hidden behind her silence for decades, appeared in public with sunglasses too large to mask her hollow cheeks. Emma, the star who had once blinded the town with her beauty, had vanished from social circles altogether. Rumors claimed she had fled abroad, whispers of debts and shame trailing after her like ghosts. They had rejected me to protect their image. And in the end, the image was the very thing that destroyed them. I stood on the opposite side of the street, staring at the mansion through its broken gates. I had imagined this moment countless times, the day I would see them fall, the day I would feel nothing but triumph. And yet, as I gazed at the ruins of my family's empire, what I felt was something more complicated. It was not pity. It was not joy. It was release. The fire that had burned in me for so long was finally quiet. I no longer needed to fan its flames. The revenge I had built in silence, the storm I had unleashed, had done its work. Their pride had consumed them, their lies had unraveled them. I had not destroyed them with my own hands, I had only nudged the truth into the light. The rest they had done to themselves, and I was free. Free from the weight of wanting their love. Free from the endless hunger for approval that had chained me to them. For the first time in my life, I belonged entirely to myself. Daniel found me there one evening, standing in the shadows of the broken gates. His footsteps crunched on the gravel as he approached. "You came to see the ashes," he said quietly. I nodded. "I had to know it's real." He stood beside me, hands in his coat pockets. We watched the empty house together, its windows dark, its silence heavy. After a long pause, he asked, "Was it worth it?" I thought about the nights spent writing in solitude, the whispers gathered in shops, the careful weaving of secrets into traps. I thought about the tears, the anger, the ache of betrayal. And I thought about the strength I had built in the silence, the woman I had become because of it. "Yes," I said at last, "because I'm not who I was anymore. They tried to erase me. Instead, they carved me into something stronger." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Just promise me something. Don't let their ashes be the only thing you live for. Build something of your own." His words settled into me like seeds. I realized then that revenge had been my bridge, not my destination. I had walked across the fire to reach this side of myself, and now it was time to build, not out of spite, but out of freedom. That night, back in my small room above the florist's shop, I opened my notebook for the last time. I flipped through the pages filled with anger and grief, with strategies and secrets. Then, on the final page, I wrote only one sentence: "I am no longer theirs." I closed the book and placed it in the bottom of my drawer, not as a weapon anymore, but as a relic of who I had been. In the weeks that followed, I began writing again, not letters to ghosts, not maps of revenge, but stories. Stories about women who refused to be silenced, about broken daughters who found their voices, about strength born in shadows. Words spilled freely, not from wounds, but from healing. Mrs. Patterson often left small bouquets at my door, lilies and wildflowers that filled my room with color. The florist shop thrived, and I found myself helping more, arranging blossoms not as an escape, but as a craft I loved. The bookstore became my second home, where I read aloud to children on Saturday mornings and found myself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. And sometimes, Daniel and I walked the quiet streets at dusk, not as savior and broken girl, but as two souls learning to build again. He never asked for details I did not offer. He only walked beside me, steady and silent, and that was enough. The scars remained. They would always remain. But scars are not chains, they are maps of survival. Each one told me I had endured. Each one reminded me I had risen. The mansion across town would continue to rot, its windows empty, its halls echoing only with ghosts of laughter and lies, but I no longer belonged there. My home was no longer made of marble and gold. It was made of words, of flowers, of small kindnesses, of strength forged in silence. As spring deepened into summer, I stood one morning at my window, the sun pouring across my desk, and I whispered the words that closed one life and opened another. I am my own beginning. The ashes of the past lay behind me, and before me stretched a horizon I was finally ready to walk toward, not as the forgotten daughter, not as the girl they tried to erase, but as the woman who had risen from the fire and awakened to her own power.